In this video, I will be showing you how to do sample number 19, which is called a bias bound hem, in which we are using bias tape, but instead of on an edge, we are using it on an armhole and making the bias tape ourselves. So let me show you what you need to do to get started. So you will get one of these templates, and you'll need to cut out the pieces so that they look like this, and that they are ready for using to cut out your fabric pieces. And the grain needs to go up and down here, you know, pretending that this was like a vest. So yeah, that is where how you will align these pieces on the fabric. And then you also need to cut out your bias tape. And so if you remember the video I showed you talking about warp, weft, and bias, the bias is the diagonal direction of the grain. So I had this square piece of fabric, and I folded it diagonally, and then pretty much cutting out the bias is just a matter of folding it along the diagonal and then just cutting it about 1 inch wide. Just make it 2 inches wide. A nice long strip to give yourself plenty of leeway for sewing that on there and folding it. Okay, so once you've cut both of your pieces, this is basically what it should look like. So one side of the vest, the other side of the vest, and then this bias tape that you cut on the bias. So it should, you know, be X's cross hatch in this direction. And the first thing you need to do is you need to sew this theoretical shoulder seam together. So you're going to put the pieces together, and you will notice that unfortunately with these two pattern pieces, that the shoulder isn't quite the same length. But that's okay. It might have just been a drawing error. Sometimes pieces are meant to be different shapes. They're not always going to be the exact size and shape, because trying to make pattern pieces that contour around the body, often they need to be different shapes depending on the area. So ultimately, we want it to be connected like this, right, at the shoulder. And then eventually connect, you know, this, because it's going to be a vest. So in order to attach the shoulder piece like this, we need to sew them together like this. With the muslin, you can't really, there's not really like a right and a wrong side. But when we start getting into fabrics that have patterns, you might have, you know, a floral print on one side, and then on the back they're not going to waste ink and make that pattern. So the side that doesn't have a pattern or ink is the wrong side. The side with, you know, the pattern, the design that's bold and bright, that is the right side. So if you want the seam, you know, the shoulder seam to be on the inside, so that the patterns and designs are on the correct right side, but you know, the seam is on the inside, you have to put the right sides together and then, you know, sew, and then you would flip. So again, with this muslin, it doesn't matter, but you'll want to do that first. I just recommend you kind of just put the shorter piece kind of in the middle like that, and just sew across, and just do 1/2 inch seam allowance for that top part. So when you are cutting the bias, make sure that it is 1.5 inches wide, and I recommend that you, you know, take your two pieces before you cut it and just kind of measure to see how long you're going to need it to be. and leave like an inch on both sides. So I made mine super long, and it's totally okay to make it extra long because you can always just trim it down. But, you know, at least make it at least about, should be at least, I can't get my ruler in the right direction here. It should be at least a foot long, minimum, but to be on the safe side, you know, just add a few extra inches in length. That's totally fine. Okay, so once you have sewn your shoulder seam, make sure that you iron it flat and open. You know, that's on the inside or the wrong side. Next, you're going to sew up the side seam, which is just this part right here underneath the armpit where the armhole is. Do not sew up the armhole because it needs to, after you've sewn this side here, it needs to remain a hole. Otherwise, there's no point if you sew it up. So you're just sewing 1/2 inch seam allowance right here. Okay, so once you have sewn both seams, shoulder seam and side seam, this is what it should look like. And then you're going to take your bias tape, and basically the first thing we need to do is we're going to start with the shoulder seam up here, and we need to start attaching the bias on the inside. So this outer edge of my bias should line up with this shoulder seam like this, and leave like an inch right here. So basically I'm gonna sew, you know, in this direction. So I want my pins to be coming out this way. And always make sure you pin seams open and flat. So you can see my seam right there, pin that side. And this is where I'm gonna start. And I wanna just leave like this extra flap, just in case I need to do any adjusting. And then this is kind of where it gets a little bit tedious and tricky. So pinning this, you know, straight piece along a curve is going to take some patience and some pinning, a lot of pinning, and a little bit of stretching. So I recommend that you kind of go little bit by little bit. And I usually stretch them out together like this. And then I line them up, and then I throw a pin in. So same thing here. I'm lining them up. I'm gonna kind of, you can kind of do this motion. Line them up and pin. So we're gonna have a lot more pins per inch, and that's totally okay. So again, we are on the inside here. We're pinning this along the armhole, and the bias tape is going to face, you know, this direction, and make sure to pin seams open and flat and leave a little extra at the top, and we start from the top shoulder seam and go around. Let's go ahead and pin everything. Okay, so I officially finished pinning. So as you can see, I kind of had a little bit longer extra on this side. I started at the top shoulder seam and I pinned it all the way around. And now, starting again from the top shoulder seam, go ahead and sew, you know, 1/8 inch, which would be about inner width of the presser foot. So if you line this edge up with the very right edge of the foot, it should, or excuse me, if you line this edge up here with the inside right toe, then it should sew right about here in the middle. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, so I finished sewing all along there. And one thing I want to say is be really careful when you are sewing, because you know you might be sewing along and then all of a sudden this fabric underneath is, you know, it's crinkling and wrinkling and you can just be going right along here and forget about it. So sewing this part's going to take a long time too, because you're going to want to make sure you're constantly adjusting this fabric underneath, making sure it's smooth. You might have to like feel, you know, through the fabric with your fingers just to make sure there's no wrinkles. And then you might go a little more. Again, smooth out, maybe just kind of tug it a little, make sure it's smooth and you're not gonna, you know, sew any like gathers underneath. And then, you know, same thing, keep going, straighten out that fabric underneath. And let's see if I was able to do it without any tucks. I think I was able to do it without any on the first try here. But it's obviously not my first try because I've been doing this for a while. Yes, so you should be able to, along this entire edge, sew it without any tucks. You know, like it almost looked like a tuck formed there, which is when the fabric just gets pinched, you know, and then it starts to form, you know, it might look something like that if it's tucked. So I just barely avoided any tucks, and that's exactly what you want to have happen. So then the next thing you need to do is just sew these two flaps closed. So you'll just kind of turn this vest sideways again, and you'll just go over to the machine and holding these, you know, these two flaps together, you're just gonna sew them closed, like right along there, without catching the main vest part. So go ahead and, you know, you could even pull the vest a little bit to one side while you just get these sewn closed. All right, so I sewed my little flappies together, and now I can trim them down to 1/8 inch. I don't need all that extra bulk. Okay. Trying to show you the vest shape here. And then go ahead and trim this seam in half as well. So you're going to probably just get your little 2-3 inch baby scissors out and just cut that sucker in half. Alright, once you've finished trimming down that seam, then go ahead and just kind of pull it out like this. And then you're going to transfer it to the technically the outside, because the seam's here on the inside. And then we're going to need to then iron this next. So that's where these like little mini ironing boards or little ironing objects come into play, because now you can kind of wiggle it on there. And you want to make sure that you kind of wiggle till you get to the, you know, the absolute fold. And you're going to need to iron this all the way around so that it's nice and crisp. And then once you're done ironing it, this flap will have gone to the outside here. So go ahead and, like I said, I'll repeat that. After you cut, you know, flip that out, and then flip it inside this armhole, and then you're going to want to iron this so it's crisp, and I'll show you what to do next. Alright, so once you finish trimming and flipping the seam to the inside, or the flap, then, you know, you'll have ironed it so it's nice and crisp on the edge there. you know, all the way around. But this is still the inside of the vest. So now we need to come and kind of open this up to the outside of the vest. So now, and it kind of wants to like fold in on itself, but you know, so outside is where you don't see the seams, you know, just this nice line. And the next step from here is we want to now fold it, do it like essentially a double fold. So go ahead and fold the first time, actually use the seam that you originally sewed this bias tape on. Go ahead and fold it just right along that seam. Use it as a guide. So I hope you kind of see what I'm doing. I'm just kind of getting it ready first. And then it's kind of optional. It's up to you if you would like to like iron this before you do the second fold. So then the second fold is then simply a matter of folding it down like that. Okay. Make sure it's touching that seam, then fold again. Make sure it's touching the seam, fold again. Make sure it's touching the seam, roll it down a little, fold again. Same thing here. So then it'll end up, you know, looking like this, right? But we're not quite done because that's not going to stay just folding it like that. So the end result that we want is we need to sew this final double fold down, and we're going to be doing that by inner width of the presser foot. So when you have this on the machine, you'll align this edge of the fabric here with the left inside toe, and that'll give you that nice 1/8 inch seam allowance. And so you're going to do that here, and I highly recommend that you pin this, not just kind of go over there and do it, because you want to make sure that everything is even, you know, and you want to make sure that seam lines match up. So, and I would even highly recommend that you iron this, because that'll just, again, that'll keep things kind of much more straight and even, and it'll just make sewing easier. My word of advice on this part is to just be super careful about avoiding tucks. So that means, you know, when you're sewing along, you know, and then the fabric over here is like starting to wrinkle, you just need to always be monitoring. So like stop what you're doing, stop the sewing, kind of come over here with your other hand, feel out for any wrinkles, you know, kind of feel for them, press them out. Then you'll go a little bit more, same thing, check underneath, make sure you don't have any, you know, wrinkles going on, because what you don't want to end up with is, it could even be so tiny, but look what a tiny tuck does, you know, to the whole garment. It makes like a line, and it was just, the fabric just got pinched just a little bit. So that is your goal. You're trying to avoid doing that. But yeah, that is pretty much how you do not store-bought bias tape on an armhole.